Hi everybody, this is a special kind of event for African Ascent. African Ascent, as you know, is always graced with the presence of highly skilled professionals representing our different professions. The program has particularly benefited for the past 2 years or so, ever since I myself became lucky to have found a fascinating job at the Berklee College of Music, which many consider to be the leading contemporary college for the study of contemporary music. Ever since I joined the Berklee College of Music, I've been quite lucky to have attracted the attention of my brilliant colleagues there. The recruitment of African Ascent has been perhaps slightly too generous to the liberal arts department, has been inviting my colleagues from the department in which I happen to be teaching philosophy and English literature. Then the program had a change of heart, and it attempted to be true to its tradition, to the tradition of African Ascent, and attention was focused on recruiting what the Berklee faculty is particularly prominently well known for, namely the musical talents there. So only lately did African Ascent begin paying attention to the great musicians at Berklee College of Music. So the interest of the program began with hosting an eventful interview with first Berklee College's own young president, Roger Brown, who gave a stellar performance about 2 months ago, and in which he spoke to the benefit of my audience about the founding mission of Berklee College of Music, his own interest in becoming its president, then his multifarious interests, not only in music, in which he practices drumming, and I'm told that he's superb at it, but he's also, along with his wife, with his significant other, an owner of a lucrative and highly impressive non-profit organization that caters to the interests of homeless children and the children of professionals in certain cities in the country, by way of making it possible for these professionals to take their children to first-rate child care centers that he and his wife have established under the name of Brighter Horizons. So at Berklee College of Music, then we were very, very lucky to have had an interview with Roger Brown himself. And now, tonight, I'm about to introduce you to an extraordinary scholar who would be shortly joining African Ascent to speak to us about Indian philosophy, the question of identities, and what she calls quite inventively, to the surprise of the academic world, humanitarian identity within a global context. Up until my guest arrives on the scene to do this highly looked at after interview on Indian philosophy and humanitarian identities, I thought of sharing with the audience the history of African Ascent, some of the themes, topics, and guests that it has invited. In about a minute or two, you're going to have the opportunity to visually interact with my guest tonight. Ashmita is her first name. I do not dare to say the last name. I will have her say it. She is a professor of English literature, but also Indian philosophy at various universities. At the moment, she's a lecturer both at Boston University and also Mass Art College. And prior to that, she has lectured and visited at Brown University as a visiting scholar there, at the Pembroke Center it's called, but also MIT, in which she also worked as a visiting scholar on feminist studies, Indian philosophies, and her recent venture and her recent interests in the perennial theme of our time, namely questions of identity. My guest is about to arrive now, and until she does so, I'll keep on talking to my audience, all those of you who keep on acknowledging my services, my modest services to the human condition by way of running this interesting and useful program in the format of a talk show, and I have been quite lucky to have been doing it for about 5-6 years now. So my guest is on her way now. She's just about to come into the studio, and the interview is about to begin. While I'm waiting for her, I would also like the audience to know that I will continue to focus my attention on the Berkeley faculty, both the musicians and also the professors at Liberal Arts College, and a few others. Well, African Ascent is honored and genuinely intrigued to have a special guest tonight about whom I have spoken very briefly while I was waiting for her. I'm going to give her an opportunity to speak about herself first before we begin discussing the themes of her highly fascinating and profound book that the publishing world has hailed as a great contribution to discussions of identity. So let me take this opportunity and ask my guest to introduce herself to the audience. Please introduce yourself. Welcome to African Ascent.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be part of this TV show, being interviewed by my dear friend Tewodros. I would like to introduce myself as a global feminist woman. I remember the two words I'm using, global feminist woman, because I feel that feminism sometimes misleads people, because it seems that sometimes feminism has this connotation of excluding everyone else, you know, but not just feminism excludes everyone. Sometimes because of the ethnic identity, we are put on a straitjacket of being a colored woman. And I want to declare here my identity as a woman of global identity, global feminism, and I specifically want to emphasize the word global, and by that I also mean universal, because we, at this moment in our global discourse, global identity, global arena, it is very important that we focus on the term universal and global instead of just colored woman or being local. So I think that's the best way I can introduce myself.
That's an excellent introduction. And what I thought we should do, Ashmita, if I may call you so.
Sure.
Incidentally, Ashmita is a professor of English literature.
Liberal arts, yes.
At the liberal arts department at Mass Art College at the moment. But you've also lectured at Boston University.
Yes.
Right? You've been a guest lecturer and a visitor at the Pembroke Center.
Yes, for a
Brown
long time,
University
for 10 years, yes.
For 10 years.
Yes.
At the Pembroke Center.
Yes.
Remarkable. And also a visiting scholar at MIT.
MIT. Currently I am at MIT, but before being at MIT, my book, Humanitarian Identity and the Political Sublime, has been written while I was at Brandeis.
At Brandeis.
So 2 years, but that's sort of, offered me an environment,
yes, of course,
an ambience where I sort of produced in a literary way the term political sublime.
I see.
That gave me that context.
That's right.
The atmosphere at Brandeis.
That's right.
Yes.
So what I thought we should do for the benefit of my audience is to talk about Indian philosophy. As you know, the great India is not only one of the centers of the birth of human civilization, globally speaking, but it's also one of the centers that produce philosophy. What we call philosophy now, which is increasingly becoming treated for all kinds of reasons as an exclusively European intellectual enterprise, as a matter of fact, was first and foremost originated and then was refined and sculpted by great centers of civilization, such as the Great Egypt, China, and of course India. Long before we came to associate what we call philosophy to be a particular practice of people of European descent, because we're so accustomed to think that philosophy is strictly and almost completely first Greek and then a quality of other European nations. If we look back objectively and dispassionately, what we learn is that long before Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all the greats began treating philosophy as coterminous with Europe, we've had great practitioners of it in Egypt, in India, and in China. At the moment, for example, at Berklee College of Music, I'm teaching a course called Eastern Philosophy, and we just did the first major contributions of the Gita, the great text of the Gita, and Confucius, and we're about to move to Aurobindo eventually. So what I thought you should do for us is to give us a crash course on the self, the human self, as Asian philosophical literature has written about it. And then we're going to somehow use that discussion as a grounding of global feminist Indian contribution to the discussion of what you call identity, humanitarian identity.
Yes,
so
yes.
give us a crash course on
Okay.
the contributions of
So I could be elaborate on that, detailed. You want
Okay.
the detailed, yes. As you mentioned, the Indian philosophy, I think the first, I could not help but start with this sloka that Madhu bata ritayate madhu karanti shindhava mardhinna parthiba raja. So according to the ancient Indian philosophy, which of course existed thousands of years ago prior to the existence of what we called the European philosophy and even Greek philosophy, including Socrates, Plato, etc. This Indian philosophy came up, the just loko that I just uttered, which means that madhubata ritayate madhu karanti shindhava mardhinna parthivaraja, meaning that we are surrounded by this cosmic sense of happiness or bliss. So bliss is the source of existence, and everything arises from bliss and ends in bliss. Madhu literally means honey. Madhu bhata ritayate, and honey has a lot to do with the sweetness, not the way the America we use honey, not in that sense, but in it is a very rich philosophical connotation. So bhata ritayate, so the entire world is enveloped, overwhelmed with the pouring of that nectar and honey. And so we need to look at life, look at self from that perspective of happiness, not the utilitarian concept of happiness, but the happiness which resides in your soul and heart. So what is this origin of happiness? This origin of happiness, the root of happiness resides in your own self, in your own soul. So it rises from here, but it is also connected with what we call in Indian philosophy the concept of the absolute Brahma, and Ananda, concept of Ananda, which means literally bliss. So the self has to be connected with the blissful existence of Brahma. And also we conceive in Indian philosophy, ancient Indian philosophy, that everything else, like you can see the table, the sofa, you, I, everyone, even the objects that we see around us, they are reflection of the Brahma, the concept of the absolute, and that gives you the privilege to think of that interconnection that we have, the world has, with not only just the human soul, but the objects around.
Incredible.
So the self then gets connected to Brahma through that sense of blissfulness, that we came from Brahma and we merge in Brahma. The whole world is a manifestation of Brahma. And I have spoken about it in my first book, Jouissance. Yes. Jouissance is Ananda, Indian philosophy, feminist theory and literature. There if I may talk about the West a little bit, the French feminist Lucy Gray, I think I was enamored of her theory because she is enamored because she explored that blissful state of existence for both men and women in Indian philosophy. Right. And first she started with Greek philosophy, but then she found her supreme bliss or happiness or solace in Indian philosophy, and went to that sense of bliss. But then I interpret, so I picked up the term jouissance from her, and through a little critique of the way she explored the jouissance in the Western psychoanalytic term, I sort of agree with her, but I deconstruct her theory just to take it forward to my Indian philosophy and connect it with Ananda. So again, Ananda, that blissful source of existence, bliss that you need to achieve the concept of the absolute or bliss. And one more step, if I may include, is that in order to achieve that blissful state of existence, you need to go through a process called ego transcendence. You have to go, because that's the lacuna or lack of the West, that we sort of the Western world, in terms of, if you think of Freud, Freud can think of only ego, id, and superego, but it's a problematic for the Western world to think in terms of ego transcendence. Whereas you mentioned the Gita, even in the Gita, this ego transcendence has been talked about. So the supreme ecstasy or bliss that you can achieve in Indian philosophy comes, or the self that you asked me about, it comes from the sense of bliss. And how can you attain that sense of bliss? You can attain it the moment you step out of your ego's boundary.
It's
And
incredible.
ego transcendence.
Let's,
Practice ego transcendence.
Let's think through this, if you like, in greater detail, because it will directly, I think, center our discussions of identity. I'm fascinated, again, in the Upanishad Gita text, when there is this incredible discussion about the relationship between two kinds of selves. There is the self of the body, of the flesh, in which we center all our individual identities. The body that I have now, the mouth through which I'm speaking to you, the table in which I'm sitting, and so on, are manifestations of this bodily empirical self that I am embodied in. But there is another self, the text says, the universal self, that is inside all of us. When we measure our identities, our who-ness, our who we are, and our who we could be, in terms of the existence of this hidden universal self inside us, it appears as if what we call an identity, an empirical identity, disappears. It vanishes. It dies.
You have to feel that moment of when it vanishes, you know, that sort of dissolution of dissolution of yourself.
Dissolution of yourself. But then there is this universal self that never dies, through which we attain some kind of immortality. There is this remarkable conversation between a nervous character by the name of Arjuna and his teacher, Sri Krishna. Arjuna is worried about death. He's anxious about it. And Sri Krishna says to him, what are you worried about?
Vishwarupa Darshana Yoga. He sees the universe inside his.
That's right. What are you worried about? He tells us. You're worrying about what you should not worry about, because what you're worrying about is the body, the empirical body, which by definition is subject to death. It's going to vanish. What you should be worrying about more, he told them, which you're not worrying about, is the self that does not die.
Die, yes. Najayate briyate nahannate hannamane sharire. It's this sloka. Vashangshi jirnani jata bihayo nahannate hannamane sharire. We die, but the soul never dies. Yes.
So he tells him, so I shouldn't be afraid about death then. He told him, no, there's nothing to be afraid of. What you should be afraid of is the possibility that you may die without discovering the self inside you that never dies. He said, you're wasting your time, Arjuna. Cultivate your soul. Cultivate yourself. Prepare yourself for this other life. Because the life about which you're worrying, the death of your beloved one, even your own death, is simply silly, irrelevant. Because you're going to die. The small self is going to die. But the universal self is not going to die. On this measure, he tells him, strictly speaking, there is no death.
There's no death, yes.
Amazing.
Amazing.
So comforting. When I introduced my students to this theme, all of them wrote me papers thanking this great Indian teacher for helping them to free themselves from the fear of death. That when their parents die, when their beloved ones die, they're going to discover, strictly speaking, they are not dying.
It reminds me, if I may say, I also taught a course at Massart. It's called Culture, History, Philosophy of India, but I focused mainly because of my passion, the classical philosophy. They read Isha Upanishad, edited and translated by Sri Aurobindo, and they are mesmerized. They were telling me they are hypnotized and mesmerized, and they not only they wrote wonderful papers, they told me that we found something. We are looking. I was looking. There, I had a lot of graduating seniors, and they're telling me, "I feel so peaceful. I feel so peaceful because that this is a specific slok that they liked. Isa vassamidang tena taktena bhunjita. Isa vassamidang sarvasya jagang tena taktena bhunjita. Meaning the whole world, I may have skipped a few lines, but these are the two main lines, that the whole world is surrounded by Brahma. So what are you afraid of? You can surrender. So they are very much fascinated with the concept of surrender, that once you surrender to this eternal or universal identity, universal power, you can be peaceful. Absolutely. You don't have to worry about anything else in the world. And there was another place that they were caught by it, almost thralled by it. It's called that, I'll give you the translation, the face of truth is covered by a golden lid. So the golden lid refers to the material wealth. So once you can uncover that golden lid, you see Brahma, you see the truth. So all you have to do in order to achieve that supreme self in this life, you have to get rid of some of your material desire. So they fell in love with that.
The concept of detachment.
Yes,
is what
they loved it. Detachment. They were looking for it, and they kept on telling me, we find so peaceful, we feel so peaceful, we find so much peace.
That's exactly what they told me also.
Yeah.
And I myself, ever since I began teaching Eastern philosophy, began looking at the question of death very differently. I'm comforted now. In fact, sometimes I even look forward to death. It is not anything to be afraid of. It's the possibility of releasing the self, the small self, from attachment to things that do not matter. The desires, the material wants, the competition, the obsession with careers, with opportunities, the selfishness, the greed, the inability to tolerate differences, because the ego is foremost interested in defending its territory. Once you see the tension between this desiring self and the self that never desires, the self of the other world, you feel the surge, the urge to free yourself from this selfish self, so as to live selflessly.
Selflessly,
the notion
going
of
beyond your ego
is such a central preoccupation in Indian philosophy. Am I right
about
that?
Yes, like Sri Aurobindo in his, now if I may talk a little bit about my current, the book that Humanitarian Identity and the Political Sublime, I coined the term, Political Sublime. Sri Aurobindo in his, this is not the quote-unquote spiritual book, it is called the humanitarian, it's called the human ideal of human unity, and in that specific book there is a chapter, supra-rational ultimate of life, rational ultimate of life, and I find it absolutely fascinating, because he's saying that and that's the juxtaposition of these two philosophers I have also in this book, in this new book, Humanitarian Identity and the Political Sublime. If it is possible, one of the main questions that I'm arguing, if it is possible to bring reason and spirituality together, or put it another way, if it is possible to bring reason and emotion together, or if it is possible to bring reason and purified sense of emotion, not just emotion, purified sense of emotion together. Okay, Sri Aurobindo, and I bring in this regard, I bring two philosophers. One of them is Amartya Sen,
yes,
and the other, my spiritual guru, Sri Aurobindo.
Yes.
Amartya Sen, it is fascinating when he talks about reason, because we definitely, it is it's a common sense. We cannot achieve anything without reason. But interestingly, for these two Indian philosophers, both of them, they're very, educated in the Western world. And let me say a little bit about Sri Aurobindo. He also studied in King's College, Cambridge. So he has this Western education. And interestingly enough, both these philosophers, they were influenced by the Western Enlightenment philosophy.
Yes.
And you see that their fascination, in Sri Aurobindo as well, as I'm going back to that, suprarational ultimate of life, he also foregrounds reason as well, with a slight critique, in which I'm going to go in a short while. But both of them, what fascinated me when I studied both of them for the book that I wrote, that both of them are grounded in Western Enlightenment philosophy, with a slight difference. The difference resides in the fact that whereas Amartya Sen is emphasizing only on reason or rationality, Sri Aurobindo comes with a critique of rationality.
What kind of critique?
Specifically, the critique that he has offered in his chapter, Suprarational Ultimate of Life. Okay, reason, so this is what, let me summarize the quote that I've used in the book, that reason has certain limitation because reason makes you egocentric. If you are only bound by the world of reason, you cannot stay beyond your ego's boundary, and sometimes it can mislead you.
I see.
So we need to have something, another faculty of mind, which is called, he calls it suprarational ultimate of life, a sense of, I call it purified sense of emotion. You need to bring that sort of spirituality or suprarational ultimate of life, which you can achieve only through ego transcendence.
I see.
So you have to, because reason puts you within that narrow boundary of the ego, whereas you need to use another faculty called ego transcendence, and he also has a name for it. Interestingly enough, he also calls it religion of humanity.
I see.
When that is his Sri Aurobindo's way of interpreting Enlightenment philosophy or rendering it through Indian philosophy.
I see.
That which believes in a divine soul and a spirit, and the divine soul and the spirit will unleash you from the boundary of the ego and will let you be connected with that ultimate reality or spirituality, which you mentioned earlier in terms of universal self. So if the humanity can be connected through that framework of what he calls the religion of humanity, not dogmatic religion, but religion of humanity, where you give importance not just to nation, not just to class, race, but you give importance to the humanity. Remember, I mentioned that I think of myself as a global person, global feminist woman, not Indian, not American, not Bengali. There's another ethnic identity I have, Bengali. So it's very important. So if I saw that, I know this is sort of very difficult when you try to unite materiality with spirituality, but that's what I'm striving to do by bringing in these two philosophers together, because although Sen, in his recent book, Idea of Justice, I'm very happy that he is turning towards this theory of transcendence.
Yes.
Much more leaning, because in Argumentative Indian, he talks about moral imagination, which is close to the ego transcendence, but he never used the word transcendence. And I'm very enamored to see that he used this word.
Okay.
And this, I see, I'm in my third book project now, and while I'm writing this, I'm seeing that I'm reading him through the spiritual philosophy, and I'm seeing a very slight spiritual turn, subtext. He's not very open about it, but I see the subtext.
Okay. Let me ask you a very difficult question that I'm myself struggling with as I think through the lens of Indian philosophy, namely this. Is it an accident, do you think, or is it a deliberate intention in classical Indian philosophy, in the Upanishad, Gita in particular, that the word reason or rationality is not even mentioned once?
It is not mentioned specifically in ancient Indian, like you mentioned, Upanishad, but there are other schools of philosophy. There are 6 schools of philosophy, and I think what Amartya Sen is enamored of is the Charbak philosophy. That's the material school of philosophy, which believes only in reason. And also we had a spiritual philosopher in Bengal. His name is Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He used to, and they had this, Bengal had the tradition of these pandits. He was only 10-year-old, but he used to go associate with these pandits and argue and argue. So we have, it is not there because, let me get back to that, because I think Upanishad specifically does not talk about reason, rationality, which I have thought. It's a very good question.
Have you thought about this?
I thought about it many times. Very good question. Because we don't know any definite author of Upanishad.
Yes.
It's written by a number of writers. And we call it Arshoproyag. We don't know which munis or the saints who wrote that. But we know there were some women also in that group.
In that group.
Yes, definitely. Because there are 2 women there mentioned, Gargi and Moitri, in that the school of writers, but we do not know, like Jaggobalka, one of the saints, and Moitri, Gargi. So no, this is because, and what I can assume is that what I can infer is that it's the emphasis is on spirituality, ego transcendence.
Right. Because by reason, as you know, ever since Plato, who even uses a much more expansive term, rationality, as opposed to reason, and then Aristotle, who is more consistent in his use of reason. In both instances, these 2 philosophers essentially defined reason as the ability to argue by logically drawing certain conclusions from carefully thought out premises which cannot be questioned. Once the premises are framed, then the ability to reason is nothing more than that capacity that allows you to draw valid conclusions from premises that have been firmly established. Reason then, on this view, becomes reduced to nothing more than the ability to draw conclusions from particular premises. The Upanishad, Gita, and other forthcoming ancient Indian texts seem not to have thought very much about this particular capacity, because they have 2 deeper constructs, which I and you respectively called the empirical self and the universal self, through which what you call brilliantly identity could be established. Identity, on this view, becomes nothing more than cleansing yourself from attachment to the empirical self, so as to discover a universal self in all human beings. Hence, humanitarian identity.
Yes.
Not how they have worked it out.
No.
There is no discussion of argumentation. There is no discussion of drawing appropriate conclusions from certain premises. It appears, in fact, as if the human being can discover who he or she is when it detaches itself from the need of being reasonable, if by reason we mean the ability to argue.
And also being selfish.
Don't you think? I'm just
yes,
working this out extemporaneously.
Yes.
And just help me out.
Yes, of course. I think you put it very nicely. I very much like the way you say that it's establishing your conclusion. You already have premises, and it's a very clever way of, working your way up or out.
I think so.
Yes.
It's so calculative.
It's so calculative. But not that I am leaning towards the West, but it was still the way of West's fighting, the dogmatism of Christianity. You know, if you go back to the Enlightenment philosophy, that's the reason they inculcated. And there are philosophers like Hume or Kant. They follow the integrating emotion a little bit. But let me go back to Kant and establish why that is inadequate. Because there is a section in the last chapter when I established my theory, Political Sublime, where I critique Kant and bring Kant and Sri Aurobindo together. Because, it's fascinating. Maybe I'm using the word fascinating too much. I would say it's very appropriate that Kant made a distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. And primarily from reading Kant, probably my own theory came up as well. But deconstructing Kant, yes, I'm going there. So beautiful and sublime. But the problematic that I found in his theory resides in the fact that he is isolating beautiful from the sublime.
Yes.
So, in other words, if you have sensory perception, you can perceive beauty, but that beauty or sensation of beauty or perception of beauty is separated from the perception of the sublime.
I see.
So he is sort of putting a shackling sublime into that prison of reason.
He's
imprisoning.
Not spiritual enough.
No.
He's not sufficiently transcendental.
So he is separating the. So in other words, according to him, senses and spirituality, they cannot go together.
Absolutely.
So there is a divorce between the two.
He divorces the two.
The two, because then sublime means something which is very erudite or impersonal.
That which is beyond the senses. That which cannot be comprehended by the senses.
Yes. Now Sri Aurobindo, he combines the spirituality, the senses and the spirituality together.
In what way?
And
enlighten me on that.
I would love to refer to his spiritual book, The Life Divine, and Savitri, mainly Life Divine, where he gave us his theory or philosophy of supramental consciousness. So according to this theory or philosophy, you have different levels of mind. You and I are talking, this is just our, I would say the higher mind, because we are talking spiritually. And mind, higher mind, above mind, illumined mind, intuition, overmind, supermind. So there are about seven layers. So important thing to notice is that important layer is the overmind layer. When you are, obviously, when you are sort of inculcating, and it's not just yogic or spiritual practice, because I don't want to reduce it to the level of the so-called yoga that is practiced here. It's a sort of a mental process. I would say I also established him as a psychoanalyst, like a Eastern psychoanalysis. You can talk, you can refer to it in that way. So as you try to think seriously or with conscience, with some kind of thoughts in your mind of the universal self or universal power or universal concept of absolute, you automatically raises your consciousness level higher. And when you reach that overmind plane of consciousness, you are being connected to the outside world, but in a very noble way, not your inferior self, a self which is very elevated in its level of consciousness. But the ultimate level is called supermind. In the supermind level of consciousness, you are completely rid of your ego, and you are really connected to the concept of the absolute or Brahma, because you have gone beyond, you have crossed that boundary of the ego. Now,
including reason.
Yes, including reason. But there's one more step to it. So, but it doesn't stop there, staying at the supramental level of consciousness, achieving supermind. His philosophy or theory involves two processes. You have to come down. That's where reason is involved even more. It's called descent. That process is called ascent, when you are reaching that level of supermind, level of consciousness. But then with that heightened level of consciousness, you have to come down. You have to bring it down to this plane, to the material plane, and that he calls descent. And when the supermind joins you here in the material plane, then there is no more divorce between senses and sublime. The sublime
united.
is coming to your empirical self, to your body, to your senses. Yes, and but you become maybe a different self, a transformed.
And that's when you become blissful. Then.
Blissful, but there is a lot of connotation, like as if spirituality is bad, but it's not like that. It is. He said also, all life is yoga. You know, you can practice it in your day-to-day life, everyday life. Maybe that's where also I'm a little influenced in my theory of political sublime, that you can use that sublime in your own life, in your everyday practice. And I use the politics, in alluding to this everyday life, everyday practice. So you can, in other words, bring empirical self and universal self. And when you bring those two selves together, you also achieve, that helps you achieve the humanitarian identity.
The Brahman and the Atman.
And humanitarian identity as
Incredible.
well.
I think we're now ready, although we've hardly begun the interview. I think I'm going to invite you again, realizing how busy you are, and we're going to devote an entire hour to discuss Ribondo, a brilliant philosopher that a lot of people do not know about. So we have about 10 minutes left now. Let's devote it to the claims of your book. Summarize the arguments of this book in light of grounding it in Indian philosophy. Let's talk a little bit about the political sublime, for example.
Yes,
and what you mean by humanitarian
identity and the political sublime. It is, so you want me to summarize a little bit from the main? Yes. Now, as you can see, the subtitle of the book, Intervention of a Postcolonial Feminist.
Yes.
So you may ask, so what are you doing just dialoguing with two male philosophers? So let me introduce some of the feminists, European and American feminists that I have used to develop my theory. And also, the book has also a lot of literary discussion, and I have Salman Rushdie among the male authors, and Dear Jamaica Kincaid. I have three chapters on Jamaica Kincaid.
That's fascinating.
Yes. I was very pleased with her book, At the Bottom of the River. So actually the entire book started with writing a paper writing an article at the bottom of the river. It's called The Postcolonial Feminine Sublime, which came out in CLR James Journal.
Yes, congratulations.
So thank you. Talking about feminism, I would say that the feminist who I find most close, the European feminist, her name is Teresa Brannan. I find most close to my theory, to Indian philosophical, mainly because my connection with her was also via Indian philosophy.
I see.
And so, if I can say a little bit, when I met her a long time ago, 98 or when she was at Harvard. She came from University of Cambridge, and so she wrote her book History of the Lacan and Transmission of Affect. And in our conversation, I told her it's so similar what you're saying to Brahma and Indian philosophy. And she asked me, could you write a paper? And that's the way our connection happened. Again through Brahma, even with the European. She used to call herself British Australian feminist.
I see.
So this is her theory. I think, according to her, there are two stages in in a relationship between a mother and a child. One is before birth, one is after birth. The phase before birth is obviously called intrauterine nest, the child's connection with the mother, and after birth. So she differentiates these two stages, saying that when the child is within the mother's womb, in the intrauterine nest, she has a better connection with the mother. But when the child is born, a better connection meaning that her or his desires and needs get fulfilled immediately, right away. But when the child is born, it doesn't happen that way. So the child starts hallucinating.
I see.
Hallucinating. Now you have to see that this trope she uses metaphorically, alluding to different phases of human life.
I see.
That the phase of before birth is the innocent phase of life, and after birth she also calls it a phase of imitation. And she also thinks that this is the phase when the subject-object distinction, discrimination due to gender, even race, everything gets perpetuated at that level.
That's right, at that
so
level.
her theory, so what is the solution? She says to go back to the intrauterine nest, but it's not possible. You cannot literally do that. So she's talking symbolically. So I see that going back to this journey.
State of innocence.
Yes, this is like going to the mother. And mother also means nature, and nature also means going to be united with that supreme self, going back to the self, again going back to the self through the mother, through ego transcendence. And I see it so well developed in Jamaica Kincaid's At the Bottom of the River, in her story The Mother at the Bottom of the River. You can see the mother-daughter connection and the way the relationship is achieved.
We have about 2 minutes left, in fact 1 minute left. As it concerns, I was so mesmerized by Indian philosophy, which is the grounding of the possibility of what we call human thinking, that I was not sufficiently generous to the discussion of her fascinating work on the political sublime, humanitarian identity within a global context and political sublime. The professor, who is quite busy, has agreed to return to African Ascent in a future date so that we can continue the interview exactly where we have stopped tonight. We have about 1 minute left, I think, so I'm going to give her a few seconds left to sum up her work, and also promise to come back to African Ascent and do the work for us.
What a pleasure. Again, I end on the note of political sublime, because the journey started exploring Kincaid's book through this Australian British philosopher, but it was, again, the grounding was in Indian philosophy. Then finally it developed into the book. The article developed into this book, and I also have another chapter from discussing Kincaid's Among Flowers on globalization.
I see.
So, but the last chapter I think is most important, where I sum up the theory of political sublime. So we need to practice sublimity in everyday life. And once we do that, we'll achieve humanitarian identity.
And how do we practice sublimity in our everyday life, as you put it so poetically?
What we are doing now, I see as an example of practicing sublimity, because we are talking about consciousness raising. And this is one example that I could give, practicing sublimity. And when any global terror occurs, to perceive it with a lot of compassion, combining both reason and spirituality, would be another global example of practicing sublimity.
Well, this has been a fascinating hour that I promised my audience it would be. This has been your host, Dr. Theodros Kiros, for African Ascent.